Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I've been with J&J for 11 years. I'll show you some products as well there. Obviously a little bit tinted windows in what I show you, but hopefully the message is overall the whole aspect of new product development. So I've been doing that for 11 years, and what I wanted to do is to give you some insights, some flavor for what's in there. So it all starts with an idea, right? And a good one is usually when you can think about concept solutions which help to address a challenge. And usually the challenge is basically a clinical challenge and or a cost challenge. So you can see a couple of examples right there. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is to get better surgery, better outcome. You want to reach to more patients, and you want something which is mostly more cost effective for the healthcare environment and system there. So who's coming with the idea? Well, usually it's people like you in the room. I mean, you're the expert, you use the system every day, and therefore you experience the limitations. So you're the primary source of coming up with fantastic ideas, as we've seen in the previous talk, right? There are also other people, obviously, in the companies, marketing and sales and R&D primarily, but you also have some people outside the companies, right? I'm talking about universities and labs. They come up with different thoughts, different approaches, different materials, different manufacturing techniques, and that provides a new source of ideas. There are also some contributors and some sort of stakeholders as well with the regulatory bodies and also with the healthcare reimbursement system. And they're kind of gonna stir a little bit the sort of ideas that emerge in the sense that if it's something which is too complex and cannot be reimbursed, cannot be afforded, then those ideas are not gonna go towards that channel so much. We have to think about outside the box, but this is kind of the whole chain of events right there. So you've got an idea, that's great. Now you got to make it work. So the first step is really trying to refine the idea itself. And a good way to do it is to think about first the function of your invention. What is it going to do in terms of achievement? What are the needs for it? You know, who are going to be your end customer, your patients? And only then, when you've defined the needs, you translate that, you transfer that into technical characteristics. You also want to think of the scope of your system. So what's in and what's out of the development pathways. Otherwise, it will take 10 years. You never get anywhere. You want to stop project creep. So a nice way to do it as well is to look at what is a must in your system. You really need to have it. What's nice to have. What are delighters as well. And then you start really going through brainstorming sessions and you create concepts and you evaluate them. So the way we do it nowadays, you're probably aware, is a lot of computer simulation. So we use, the power of CADs, finite element analysis. So it's all theoretical, it's all good, but in parallel, the most powerful development pathways is to use prototyping and testing them. So have you heard about the emergence of rapid prototyping? So like 10 years ago when I started, we could do what you see on the left, little prototype of plastic, and it took a couple of days to get them done. And nowadays we can do the same in titanium in a couple of days. So it's pretty good. And then we go to the lab environment to try them. There it's the best way to do it, I find it, is to work with a team of designers and also a team of consultant surgeons. So you can focus on the design aspect, you really go to the nitty-gritty, but then you get the system assessed by an outside team of surgeons. And they are not biased, right? They're very independent and they give a very direct feedback towards the design. And that's very, very powerful. So then in parallel, you start thinking a little bit about your testing. So you make sure that you kind of screen a little bit how strong your system is going to be. And that's kind of the early concept. As you do that, you need to take care of your intellectual property right there. So you've got a good idea, excellent, but can you actually commercialize it? So you need to look at what's out there. So it's really something that you need to get patent attorneys involved, and you look at your system and say, well, if I launch it, do I have some existing patents which prevent me to do that? And if so, well, you have to design around the existing patent, or you have to think about licensing, or you have to find some prior art. And then if you come up with a very good new ideas, because you've invested a lot of time and energy, you probably want to patent as well that idea. So quite some consideration there. And you see here, I've put that for a reminder, is that when somebody files a patent, it takes 18 months for instance, in Europe with the European patent system, it takes 18 months for a patent to be granted. So what this means is, let's say you get this good idea, you develop it, and it takes 18 months. And when, just at the time you're ready to launch, you see this patent coming out, which was filed 18 months ago, and it's actually looking exactly like your system, then you're in trouble. And there's no way to go around that, so there's quite a lot of risk there. In parallel, before you actually roll out all your resources, you need to think about your business case. So companies do that. I mean, surgeons do that as well to a certain extent. So you look at the market space, the trends, product out there. You got to think about your portfolio fit. And I'm talking about the company thinking internally, but also externally. So if you introduce a new system, it's all nice, but what does that mean for the hospital? I mean, do you need to bring like a new professional education training? Do you need to replace the kit? What is the burden for the hospital? So you really have to think about like different dimensions, not just the design, oh, it looks really, really good, but is it backward compatible? You know, is it like easy to introduce it into the hospital? Does that make sense, right? You also look at your preliminary forecast, sales projection. You look at how much it's going to cost you to develop this system, and you put an initial risk management in place. And if everything stacks up, well, then you're going to allocate all the resources to develop the new system. So you do that, you do your planning. So you know this one, right? Just making sure you know who's going to do the work. You look at your timelines, your risk, and your cost. And in this day and age, what's really important is to consider the complexity of your device. So you're probably aware instruments are class 1, so you can do self-certification. Implants are class 2, so you have to do registrations. In Europe, it's kind of self-certification most of the time. In the US, it's FDA, so it's usually about like 4 months process to go through clearance. You're doing very complex instruments, they're also class 2. I have to do that. Very complex instruments, or very complex implants, class 3. Then you have to do clinical studies, very, very intensive. So you really have, to me, it's the biggest thing that you need to think of when you have a new invention, a new system that you want to put out there. Really think about the complexity in terms of regulatory, because that's going to dictate how much investment you need to put into your project development. So you think you're good to go, right? Everything stacks up. The other thing that you need to do as a company, you need to have an approved new development process. So you can no longer do it in a garage like before. And the reason is because in Europe, for instance, the European Community Medical Device Directive dictates that you need to have an approved process, which is audited by BSI, or in the US with the FDA. So you need to have this robust process in place. And it does make sense, right? Because it provides like some guidelines about the best practices, the standard testing that you have to do. You have to compile a technical file, so in terms of audit, you're covered up. So it's good, but not everybody can do it. So then you carry on the development of your system, and the biggest thing which has happened, I'd say the trends really like during the last 10 years about risk management. So now it's to a very detailed level. So every time we develop a new system, we have to look at predicate device. We have to find supportive evidence that the new design that we are working on is based on an existing design for which we've done an analysis. So we do it internally into the company. We look at our quality system, compliance that we've been having versus ourselves. We look out there for critical literature review. So we need to find clinically relevant journals, articles showing the efficacy of systems. We need to have that. We will do like the whole 9 yards of engineering design and process risk management. And then we do full verification and validation and also post-market surveillance. And I'm going to show you what that means into the next slides there. So design refinement, verification, and validation, you probably have seen this before. What you have on the left is really simple computer simulations. We always do that. You can screen basic designs and then you go into the lab. So you have standard testing for caging, for screws, for pretty much everything. We do that as well. Labs, tissue testing, to be honest, we do it all the time as well. Just really get a good feel for the system before releasing it. Very rarely we do animal studies. I mean, obviously you need to have a good rationale to do it, not to have making sure that you have your ethical committee agreement to do it, that it really makes sense. And if it's complex implants, obviously you also need to do clinical trials. The other thing that I wanted to show you on these slides is you can see here a lot of people focus on the implant testing, but you really need to think about your instruments because they're very powerful, right? So what happens to the usage of your instruments onto your implant? It looks like it's good, but maybe you damage a little bit the implant, maybe you weaken it, and for instance, for some screws, maybe like 3 months, 4 months down the line, you would have reduced the strength of your implants and it will snap. So you really need to think on the whole chain of all the components of your system there. So if you've done your design, you're pretty happy, so you're going to go to production. And then you need to validate your production. Sometimes you need to have new manufacturing techniques. You also need to make sure that everything which is manufactured, you can inspect it correctly. So you might need new inspection methods. You need to validate them as well. It's really important because here I've shown you an example of a screw. So you've got a couple of components right there. Every time you do your testing, you got a basic dimension, right? That's the ideal dimension. Everything's going to work. You've done it with your previous testing. Everything looks good. But when you manufacture it, for instance, the set screw here, it's slightly bigger or slightly smaller because the manufacturing process has a little bit of a variability. So you need to assess it, and then you need to see what is the impact if you have a set screw which is a little bit smaller or a little bit larger. Am I going to get cross-threading? Am I going to split the head? And what does that mean for the implant? Maybe it's not going to be strong enough anymore. Maybe I'm going to have rod loosening, So what it means is you need to validate your process, and then you need to come back and loop up your mechanical testing with the worst case scenarios. So there's a little bit of burden there. I talked a lot about the design itself of the implants, concretely, but what's really important as well is the interior packaging. So when you talk about indication, contraindication, surgical technique steps, or your brochure and you claim something, well, you also need to have evidence. You say, well, my implant is like stronger than another one. By how much? What testing have you done? Do you have the proof to say that? And it's actually very needed right there. So before, it's like, yeah, it just looks better. Now we have to do the whole 9 yards of testing to prove that this is true. The other thing that you need to consider is all your microbiology testing. So making sure that your design is not too complex so you can reprocess the system into the hospital through autoclaving. You need to provide like good decontamination, disassembly instructions. You need to make sure that your process doesn't contaminate your implants, right, with grease, residual oil, and we're doing a lot of sterile packaging. I mean, whether we like it or not, it's a bit of a trend, especially in certain countries. So then again, you need to do additional testing and verification. What happens if you drop the package, If it's transported into a truck and it's really cold or really hot, do you damage the sterile barrier? How long is it does it keep sterile, So a little bit more to it as well. So we're nearly there, right? So we prepare the launch, we do the actual production. In parallel, we do our regulatory approval, and sometimes it's not that easy. So I'll give you an example here with a little port that we developed to insert in an implant. So it's an instrument, so it looks like pretty straightforward, but because it's a port, in the eye of the FDA, this is a class 2. So the FDA comes back and says, hey, do you have testing for this? And what's your predicate device? and how strong does it need to be? And we have to go and provide the information. So engineering-wise, it's really straightforward. It's a tube. But you have to provide the whole documentation evidence. It needs to be reviewed, and that's a process which takes about 4 to 5 months. So really, just for a simple instruments, your timelines can be very, very long. And then in parallel, what you do is also your marketing launch plans, right? So you got to think about your centers and also your professional education. So in that sense, the design might be good, but if we're not able, as a company with associated surgeons, to really demonstrate how to make the best of the system, right? What are the tips and tricks? It's just not sufficient. So you have to really look at the big picture there, and it's really important as well. So you're good to go. You do your typical launch. So usually we start with alpha centers. So only a few centers, and then we do that for 6 months to 1 year, and then we learn from the system. And hopefully everything's fine, right? Especially for implants. We want to get them right first time. With instruments, sometimes we provide a lot of different options so that we can find different techniques, what is the best, and then we refine them, and then we go for the full commercialization of it. And then in parallel, what we do nowadays is ongoing post-market surveillance. So what does that mean? Well, it's basically we're going to monitor, to a certain extent, the efficacy of the device. So what we do internally in the company is that we record complaints. We have to do due diligence to record every complaint on the system. And every year, we track the number of complaints versus the number of sales, and we can see whether we have any trends. So I've put here like a couple of motion preservation technologies, and that makes me think of, well, hip implants, for instance, with metal on metal. And it was a great idea, right? And we got it out there, a lot of companies did, and just a few years after the launch, it looks really, really, really good. But 5 years, 7 years down the line, then you start to learn about it, and it takes time, and you really have to do all your clinical expertise there to really learn from the device and know whether it's really efficient. So in summary, what I put is what do you need? Well, the ingredients, you need a good idea. You need to have a lot of resources to do it, actually. You need a robust development process. You need a lot of hard work, but you also need a lot of luck, or a bit of luck, it depends. So that's it. Thank you very much.